Buddy, this is SAAD for the SAAD Truth. Today's talk is titled On Animal Cruelty, Veganism, and Human Nature. It is a presentation that I've long wanted to do because I've weighed in on several occasions in the past regarding my disdain for animal cruelty. And I often then get vegans who write to me or post comments expressing their displeasure with me and calling me a moral hypocrite because how could I love animals so much and then still eat them? And so yesterday I had posted the following message on my social portals. Let me read it. While exercising today, I watched a documentary on Volkswagen's fraudulent air pollution case. The part that crushed my soul was seeing a monkey being taken to a closed glass enclosure and forcefully exposed to several car exhaust emissions. The experiment itself was itself fraudulent. To look at the eyes of this sentient being, a cousin of ours on the tree of life, as it was being literally tortured, is an unbearable image. There is nothing that I abhor more in life than animal cruelty, and yes, I say this whilst recognizing that our meat production facilities are industries of cruelty, and I participate in perpetuating it via my consumer choices. No sentient being should ever be treated as though it were a commodity, void of a capacity to experience pain, anguish, torture, etc. To be enlightened moral beings requires that we set up systems that minimize unnecessary anguish to millions of animals. And no, this does not mean that we should all turn to veganism. At that point, I think my position is very clear, but as often happens when you have moral Puritans, which I was predicting would come out of the woodworks, I then subsequently posted another comment yesterday, so let me read it here for you. It is vexatious to repeatedly have some angry, irrational vegan person write to me in an abject and irrational anger whenever I express my deep repulsion toward animal cruelty because I eat meat. To these enemies of reason, there are only two options. One, you become a vegan. Two, you are a moral hypocrite and an immeasurably diabolical person. No nuance, no measured thinking, no recognition of the astounding amount of evidence in favor of the evolutionary roots of meat eating in Homo sapiens. It's binary thinking, black or white, unreal. They don't afford anyone who is not a vegan with the possibility to join their battle for the ethical treatment of animals, as you are immediately Hitler if you are not vegan. They do a disservice to the millions of animals that they supposedly care about by weaponizing their hatred toward anyone who is not part of their their Taliban club of veganism. Sorry for the typo. So again, my position is very clear. We should all strive very hard to minimize animal cruelty, and we are certainly very far from that. And there are ways to do that without expecting that all people will suddenly become vegan. But in that discussion, one of the things that I typically think about is, well, is it natural for humans to be meat eaters? And is it reasonable to expect us to completely reject a fundamental element of our evolutionary history? A fundamental element of, some argue, what makes us male and female. And I'll talk about that in a second. And no, this is not the naturalistic fallacy. It is not the is-ought problem. It is not an appeal to nature, as I will explain in a bit. I won't go into it in great detail, but to those who write to me with an incredible penchant of being Dunning-Kruger walking effects, it's not as though I don't know these issues and I haven't thought about them carefully, but notwithstanding your huffing and puffing and moral indignation, it doesn't change the fact that arguing for the evolutionary imperatives that form a central feature of human nature is not succumbing to the naturalistic fallacy. It's rather trying to implement policies that are congruent with our human nature rather than antithetical to those. It's called good public policy. In any case, I'll talk about that in a second. But so what I thought I would do, excuse my throat. What I thought I would do is just share. Now, this wasn't a detailed, exhaustive literature review. I spent a few hours a while ago, and then yesterday and today a few more hours culling it all together, where I created the equivalent of, some of you may know something that I've discussed in several posts and also in some of my publications, most recently or most fully in my Journal of Marketing Research 2017 paper on the epistemology of evolutionary psychology. I talked about how evolutionary theory, its epistemology, is about building nomological networks of cumulative evidence. This is where you get evidence stemming from many different fields, different cultures, different time periods, different paradigms, different procedures, different data sources, all of which point to an unassailable evolutionary fact. And in doing so, you then are able to truly be standing on firm footing regarding some argument that you're making. By the way, none other than Charles Darwin himself had exactly used that approach in building the arguments for on the origin of species. So when it comes to the evolutionary roots of meat eating, I was able to identify anatomical, physiological, morphological, for example, cranial and dental records, paleobiological, parasitological, archaeological, cross-cultural data, for example, looking at global food and taste preferences, anthropological, for example, looking at hunter-gatherer societies and the calorie sources that they have traditionally obtained their food sources from, comparative morphology, nutritional data, genomic analyses, genetics, medical, sexual data, and psychological data, all of which in one or more ways point to meat eating being a fundamental property of what it is to be a human. Let me discuss a few of these examples. I won't go into great details, and I have not organized these in any particular way, just a bunch of studies stemming from different paradigms and different disciplines. So in this case, this is archaeological data coming from regarding Pleistocene hominids. And if you just look at the, excuse me, I'm really sorry for my throat. This discovery highlights that by at least 1.5 million years ago, early human physiology was already adapted to a diet that included the regular consumption of meat. Now, of course, the vegans who are listening to this are saying, yes, so what? Yes, we know meat eating was part of our evolutionary history, but today we live in a different world where we no longer need to eat meat. Nonsense. But I'll come back to that in a second. Here's Smithsonian Institution. It was on the Nature website. You could look at the article "Evidence for Meat Eating by Early Humans," and they discuss data coming from all sorts of different paradigms to point to the fact that meat eating is an indelible part of our evolutionary history. Here is Scientific American. Now, some of these are, of course, scientific, popular magazines. Others I will cite, peer-reviewed sources. So this should humans eat meat? Let me just read you this little excerpt. There is no doubt that human evolution has been linked to meat in many fundamental ways. Our digestive tract is not one of obligatory herbivores. Our enzymes evolved to digest meat, whose consumption aided higher encephalization and better physical growth. Cooperative hunting promoted the development of language and socialization. The evolution of old world societies was to a significant extent based on domestication of animals. In traditional societies, meat eating, more than the consumption of any other category of foodstuffs, has led to fascinating preferences, bans, and diverse foodways, and modern Western agricultures are obviously heavily meat-oriented. So this is really pointing to the fact that there are extraordinarily important evolutionary changes and evolutionary pathways that humans have traversed, specifically linked to the fact that they became omnivores. Here's another paper in Evolutionary Anthropology, a hypothesis to explain the role of meat eating in human evolution. I'll just read this very small excerpt from the paper. Here I will argue that the pattern of gut anatomy and digestive kinetics characteristic of ancestral hominoid, they impose certain constraints on their descendants in terms of diet. Meat eating in the human lineage, Homo sapiens, appears to be one way of circumventing these constraints. Now again, the vegans are saying, yeah, so what? We know that evolutionarily speaking, we ate meat, but we don't have to anymore. The critical role played by animal source foods in human Homo evolution, Journal of Nutrition. Without routine access to animal source foods, it is highly unlikely that evolving humans could have achieved their unusually large and complex brain while simultaneously continuing their evolutionary trajectory as large, active, and highly social primates. As human evolution progressed, young children in particular, with their rapidly expanding large brain and high metabolic and nutritional demands relative to adults, would have benefited from volumetrically concentrated high-quality foods such as meat. But bruh, today we have tofu. Let's go on. Hunter-gatherer diets, a different perspective. The American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. I highlighted here for you the important thing that I want to point out. Corden et al. Attempt to estimate likely macronutrient intakes from plant and animal foods in the diets of, quote, recent, largely 20th century hunter-gatherers who are ostensibly meant to, if you like, be representative of the environments in which we've evolved, the EEA, the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. They conclude that most such societies likely derived more than half of their subsistence energy from animal foods. But bruh, celery. Here's the next one. Plant-animal subsistence ratios and macronutrient energy estimations in worldwide hunter-gatherer diets. So here they looked at all of the, or a very large database of hunter-gatherer societies. And let me just read for you here. Most 73% of the worldwide hunter-gatherer societies derive more than 50% of their subsistence from animal foods, whereas only 14% of these societies derive more than 50% of their subsistence from gathered plant foods. So, as someone pointed out, I think on my Facebook page, as though he were speaking to a 3-year-old child, because he took a course in Rhetoric 101 at Wellesley College, he says, yeah, but don't you know about, flexibility of the human condition? No, of course not, other than having written about it in books, in a million papers. But no, please teach me about behavioral plasticity. If you see me a bit irate in my responses, because there's nothing that I despise more, maybe short of animal cruelty, than people who suffer from Dunning-Kruger. There's a way to interact with someone where you recognize that they likely would have thought about these issues, and that you coming along as a 20-year-old with a photo of you kissing a baby lamb on your Facebook photo might be a bit arrogant to presume that I might not have any clue about what you're talking about. But in any case, yes, there is behavioral plasticity. As a matter of fact, as I've explained on this show, behavioral plasticity is itself an adaptation. So yes, there are societies that are much more vegetable-based in terms of their cuisines than meat-based. As a matter of fact, I talk about this when I discuss Darwinian gastronomy, when I talk about the distribution of spices in cross-cultural cuisines. Cultures that have greater pathogenic loads and are more likely to use spices. And so behavioral ecologists recognize the fact that humans are adaptive, and of course we are omnivores. So no one is saying that we are these pathological, or if you like, extreme carnivores who only are going to be satiated if we eat bloody steak. But the reality is, when we look at even existing hunter-gatherer societies, most get the great majority of their calories from animal food sources. So that, again, doesn't say anything about the moral goodness or the moral evil of meat consumption. It simply says that it is an indelible part of our human nature to certainly have food preferences that are consistent with wanting to have a juicy steak rather than a celery stick. Let's go on. Here's another paper, Annual Review of Nutrition, Evolutionary Adaptations to Dietary Changes. This actually looks at genomic studies that look at these types of things, genomic and genetic studies. Let's keep going. Well, this actually, in its title, this is in the quarterly review of biology, Meat Adaptive Genes and the Evolution of Slower Aging in Humans. I'll let you read the abstract of that paper. Again, it is part of our culture, it is part of our biology, it's part of our genome to have, to desire eating of meat. And again, this doesn't say anything about whether it's desirable in a moral sense or not. It is simply trying to argue that if you're going to have a conversation about policy issues, then those conversations should be rooted in a full understanding of our human nature. And I'll come back to that point in a bit. Let's go on to the next one. Going back to hunter-gatherers, so the paradoxical nature of hunter-gatherer diets. Why are they saying paradoxical? Because it is very much meat-based, and yet it is non-atherogenic, meaning it doesn't cause heart disease. Let me just very quickly read you some of the key highlights and the methods and results. In this review, we have analyzed the 13 known quantitative dietary studies of hunter-gatherers and demonstrated that animal food actually provide the dominant 65% energy source, while gathered plant foods comprise the remainder. And so anyway, so they go on to describe isotopic analyses, also the evidence of Paleolithic hominid collagen tissue, reduction in hominid gut size, low activity levels of certain enzymes, and optimal foraging data. All of these data, again, think about the nomological network of cumulative evidence, are all pointing to the fact that eating meat is the default value of being human. Now, that doesn't mean that some people can't fully survive and be unbelievably healthy without eating meats, but it is probably difficult to expect that all moral people to stop eating meat and become vegan, and anything short of that, you're Dr. Mengele. So I'm going to come back in a second to this idea of why is it that hunter-gatherers eat so much meat and yet they don't experience the top killers that we face in Western medicine, which, by the way, is one of the arguments that vegans use to try to compel us to not eat meat. Look, if you ate less meat, you would be healthier and you wouldn't suffer from colon cancer and diabetes and heart disease and so on. Yes and no, and let me explain why that is. So this here I refer to something that I've discussed in the past. Some of you might want to check out my discussion with Randy Nesse, one of the pioneers of evolutionary medicine. We had a chat on this show. So the mismatch hypothesis from evolutionary medicine is a very, very important concept. It basically says, look, we've evolved in an environment where certain realities that were adaptive then are no longer adaptive today. And therefore, you have a mismatch between that environment of evolutionary adaptiveness and the current environment. So for example, the fact that we've evolved in environments of caloric scarcity and caloric uncertainty means that our ancestors preferred, high caloric rich foods, whereas those exact same preferences in today's environment of plenty then create this miscalibration and hence all of the diseases that we are familiar with. So it's not so much that eating meat is bad as a deontological statement, and therefore vegans tell us stop eating meat and you'll be healthier. Eating meat is very, very healthy in the context in which our bodies have evolved to eat meat. So for example, if you exercise a lot, if you don't eat processed meats, a meat is not a meat. Different meats have different nutritional quality, and that either result, yes or no, in downstream ill effects. So we can eat meat and we should eat meat as long as we are doing so in a way that, as best as we can, tries to mimic the environment in which we've evolved in. And that's really the idea of the paleo diets and the ketogenic diets and so on and so forth. Let's go on. Next paper by Richard Wrangham from this little university known as Harvard University. No, this is not an appeal to authority. It's again to explain to the vegan rage brigade that people have very seriously spent their entire careers thinking about these things, whereas you picked up veganism a week ago at your Hug a Cow retreat. Yes, I'm being a bit testy, because if you were in my shoes and you received the kind of hate mail that I received from just unbelievably angry people, and they're angry when I'm completely on their side. I mean, I see a bird in a cage and I almost break down. I hear of a dog that was lost and I can't take it. I can't even watch National Geographic where a lion is bringing down a zebra. I start panicking. And now that doesn't make me morally inconsistent because I then eat chicken. It simply recognizes that I'm human and that I have certain preferences, food preferences, that in a sense I can't extricate myself from. Although, by the way, I was a vegetarian for roughly 3 years, from about 1996 to 1999. So it's an issue that I struggle with, and rather than being dishonest with you, I come to you and say, look, I am a huge animal lover. I abhor animal cruelty, but I recognize that it is perhaps difficult to expect all people to be vegan. So why not we hold hands together and try to find ways by which we can compel these food industries to institute practices that are extraordinarily more ethical and humane than what we currently have. That to me seems like a much more reasonable expectation if we care about animals than to say, go vegan or else you're Hitler. So anyways, this guy, Wrangham and Conklin Brittain, have a very interesting paper, and later Wrangham also wrote a book, if you're interested, looking at cooking as a biological trait. The idea that some cultural practices are due to evolutionary reasons, and so cooking, to the extent that it helps us our capacity to digest certain both plants and meats, then there are evolutionary reasons why we have evolved that cultural practice. And so my point here is that cooking has evolved in part because it allows us to it allows for meat to be more palatable for us. Here's another paper, Journal of Human Evolution, Early Hominid Hunting and Scavenging, the Role of Meat as an Energy Source. You could read the abstract on your own. Moving on. Animal source foods and human health during evolution. So this actually links, the eating of animal source foods to our health in a phylogenetic sense, in an evolutionary history perspective. Moving on. Human adaptations to meat eating. Here you have examples of parasitological data, as I mentioned early in this presentation. So if you read the abstract, you'll get to that. Next one, an evolutionary perspective on food and human taste and current biology. Not surprisingly, we've evolved a desire to eat meat. Now, that doesn't mean everyone, right? Men are taller than women, even though all female WNBA players are taller than most men. So for most of us, our expressed food preferences do involve one or more protein sources, animal protein sources. This one is very much within my area of research, as some of you know, with one of my doctoral students, former doctoral students, who was also my Masters of Science student, Eric Stenstrom, who's now a professor at Miami University. We've done studies looking at the effects of the menstrual cycle on various consumer-related phenomena, including food and beautification and so on. So this idea of how the menstrual cycle is relevant to women's preferences, desires, choices, sexual behaviors, and so on is certainly within my area of research, interest, and expertise. So here, Dan Fessler from UCLA looked at luteal phase immunosuppression in meat eating. The idea is that a woman's attraction or repulsion towards certain foods is very much correlated to where she is in her menstrual cycle for reasons that are associated with protecting a fetus from possible pathogens. I've talked about this previously, but in any case, this again is showing you that there are physiological adaptations, universal physiological adaptations that are definitional of a woman's reality that are specifically related to meat eating. But tofu. Let's go on. Here is a global survey done in 16,000 people across 17 countries, asking them what is their preferred foods. Now, any social scientist will tell you, you want to know what people do. I mean, ask them or watch what they do. How do they vote with their feet, right? People move to the West rather than to Saudi Arabia because ostensibly it seems like most people are deciding that it is better to live in free secular societies than to live in North Korea or Cuba or Saudi Arabia. And so in this case, we simply ask people, what is your favorite food? And look what they say. Pasta, which one is it? Yeah, meat is one of the 3 favorite foods. Now, if you don't want global data, but you prefer American data, well, America's 50 all-time favorite foods are revealed, with steak and chicken topping the list. Not tofu, not celery, not cucumbers sprinkled with love. Chicken, beef, bacon, and corned beef also appear in the top 10, taking the 2nd, 5th, 7th, and 8th spots, respectively. Again, if you hear a tone of being irate in my voice, it really is stemming from the fact that moral puritanism is very bad, irrespective of which religious or quasi-religious group states it, right? So the Taliban will have moral puritanical views regarding female sexuality, and so they'll say, well, it is perfectly moral that we engage or we subject our women to female genital mutilation, because it is immoral for them to not be chaste. It is immoral for them to experience sexual pleasure. The only way to maintain their chastity is to have them go through female genital mutilation, because who needs a clitoris? Or you could say, well, might there be an evolutionary explanation for why humans, both men and women, might have evolved the physiological response system to obtain pleasure from sex? And does it make evolutionary sense then to using the rubric of morality, puritanical morality, to try to reduce a woman's sexual pleasure by cutting her clitoris? Now you might say, oh, come on, you're drawing a link between female genital mutilation and veganism. It's an analogy. The idea being that to truly understand whether a particular practice makes sense or not, we do have to root it in an accurate and complete understanding of human nature, and know that is not the naturalistic fallacy. And I'll come back to that again in a minute or two. Here is some data on nutrition and health, where they compared a vegetarian group, a group that was given a carnivorous diet rich in fruits and vegetables, a carnivorous diet that was less rich in meat, and a carnivorous diet rich in meat, across a whole bunch of different chronic conditions. And there were only 4 that came up. You see them here. It is allergies, it is urinary incontinence, cancer, and mental illness. And the ones who were not vegetarian performed better. Now, I don't mean to imply, so I don't want you to accuse me of cherry picking, the literature sources. There are studies that show that being on a very low, animal fat diet, for example, the Ornish diet, can even reverse arterial plaque buildup. So I'm not suggesting that there aren't studies that demonstrate that having a low animal fat diet is not beneficial. But again, if you think of it from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense that we do obtain certainly some, if not a majority of our diet from meat sources. Which leads me to the next one. The Mediterranean diet there are 1 million dietary fads. One of the only ones that seems to consistently receive quite a bit of positive coverage is the Mediterranean diet. I should know about it, although I wish I had adhered to it my whole life. I come from the Mediterranean region. I'm from Lebanon. And if you look at it, it doesn't say don't eat red meat. But if you see here, yes, red meat, but sparingly. Fish, poultry, eggs, 0 to 2 times per day. So taking this Mediterranean diet food pyramid, I'll just repackage it for you as listen to grandma, all good things in moderation. I don't have to be a nutritional expert, although I could probably discuss it at a rather well-informed level. Not that I'm necessarily able to implement all of the edicts of a healthy nutritional diet by virtue of the fact that I've been overweight for well over 20 years. But it makes absolute perfect sense that a diet that is defined by the ethos of moderation is one that is the most sustainable. We are omnivores. It is incontestable. All of the realities, as I mentioned earlier, suggest that this is an indelible part of what it is to be human. Now I'm going to switch from some of the sources of data that I've gotten for you thus far to ones that you may have not thought of. So look at the top one, the hunting handicap, costly signaling in human foraging strategies. By the way, costly signaling is the idea, for those of you who don't know, for example, the peacock has evolved its tail through sexual selection, not through natural selection, precisely because it is a costly signal. It is a signal that basically says, look, despite the fact that I have this tail that is very big, that is burdensome, that makes it more difficult for me to take flight, that makes it easier for predators to see me, I'm still here. Therefore, I must be, this phenotype is a very good advertisement of my genetic quality. Choose me as a mate. So this is known as Zahavian signaling, or handicapping, or costly signaling. And so there's research that shows that risky hunting is a form of Zahavian signaling. In other words, it is an indelible part of human sexual selection, how women choose men, and hence that's why I put sexual data early in this presentation. And if you are still not fully convinced, despite the 13 trillion data points that I've provided you so far from endless fields, here's another one: sex differences in the attractiveness of hunter-gatherer and modern risks. So if you ask people the types of risks that someone might engage in, whether these are attractive, the ones that both sexes find attractive are the ones that are associated with hunter-gatherer risks. I won't get into what that means, but again, this shows you that we have evolved contemporary. This is contemporary data. Men and women find men who engage or who confront hunter-gatherer risks as being attractive as prospective mates. Continuing, the hunter-gatherer theory of sex differences in spatial abilities, data from 40 countries. But bruh, it's just so storytelling. So in this case, Silverman and Eels in 1992 had proposed a hunter-gatherer theory of spatial sex differences. The idea being that many cognitive, if you like, sexually dimorphic cognitive abilities that we see between men and women, it is argued that these have evolved because of the role specialization that each of the two sexes would have committed to in our evolutionary history. And so some forms of spatial abilities, or for example, memory location tasks, men perform better on, whereas others women perform better on, and these are universally robust. And the argument is that the reason why these evolved to be so, why we have these sexual dimorphisms, is because of the hunter-gatherer theory. Hunter. So sexual selection, right? What makes us male and female, of course, notwithstanding the fact that we all come with 873 genders, but what makes us male and female is in part, or what makes us attractive as male and female, what makes us perform well on some tasks but not others as male and females, is specifically linked to our hunting and gathering past. But bruh, now we could eat tofu. Gee, it seems like I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about this, maybe a bit more than Gzier from Wellesley College. But in any case, so is this appeal to nature? Is it the naturalistic fallacy? Am I succumbing to the is-ought problem? Which, of course, I'd never heard of these things until Xir came and posted this on my Facebook post. Well, let me first summarize what these three fallacies are. The naturalistic fallacy is basically saying, well, if something is natural, therefore it must be morally good. And of course, that's not true, right? The poppy seed, the plant that produces heroin is in nature, and that eventually produces all sorts of downstream ill effects associated to drug addiction. But no one's going to say, oh, but it comes from nature, therefore it's good. Appeal to nature, something is natural, therefore it is desirable. If you'd like, the appeal to nature is a subset, is a special instance of the naturalistic fallacy. The naturalistic fallacy is saying that something is specifically morally good, whereas the appeal to nature is basically saying, oh, it's natural, then it must be better or more desirable than something that, quote, is unnatural. And the is-ought, which I've specifically discussed in my work comparing prescriptive, descriptive, and normative decision making. So yes, I really need a 20-year-old to write to me to explain to me these issues. So the is-ought problem is sort of the David Hume's issue, is conflating descriptive versus prescriptive / normative positions. So is that what I'm doing here? No. I'm not using the evolutionary roots of meat eating to make moral arguments about meat eating. I'm not saying because, evolutionarily speaking, we ate meat, it means that it's morally good. I'm not making a moral statement. I'm basically saying that to understand human nature and implement policies and change cultural mores that are consistent with science and human nature and reality, then we certainly should understand whether a particular expectation is in line with human nature or inconsistent with it. I'm not making any arguments regarding the desirability of meat eating. It's not because it's natural, it's good, it's bad, it's morally repugnant or morally appropriate. I'm not making normative statements. Let me repeat, I'm merely pointing to the fact that any conversation involving human preferences, desires, choices, and behaviors must be rooted in a complete and accurate understanding of the evolutionary roots of such phenomena. This allows us to better calibrate our debates, public policies, and personal conducts in ways that fall within the expressed behavioral plasticity of the human condition. So on a related note, E.O. Wilson, the famous Harvard evolutionary biologist and entomologist, said, the genes hold culture on a leash. The leash is very long, but inevitably values will be constrained in accordance with their effects on the human gene pool. What I want you to take away from this point is that, yes, of course, humans have behavioral plasticity. And if today there are local environmental pressures to be less meat eater than in some other ecosystem, then fine. That's perfectly reasonable, and it is well in line with the fact that we have the adaptation to be adaptive to different local environments. That's perfectly fine. But any solution that we try to put forth regarding some important debate that we're having has to be rooted in a proper understanding of what it is to be human. So I'll end with this. Puritanism. This should be an I. Moral puritanism versus ethical pragmatism. This basically speaks actually to something that I've talked about previously regarding deontological ethics versus consequentialism. Deontological ethics would be, it is never okay to lie, versus consequentialism would say, well, it depends on the consequences. If you're lying to spare someone's feelings, so you commit a small white lie, well, then maybe that's okay, right? And believe me, I struggle with this issue because in many ways, I'm very much of I exist in a purity bubble, but it's not purity in this sense. Even though I exist in a purity bubble where I want things to be, perfect and neat and clean, I also exist in the real world where I recognize that we can't exist in a black or white world. There are pragmatic realities that must be taken into account. So it seems to me that it does not serve the best interests of our animal cousins to insist that the sole path toward an ethical treatment of animals is via the pursuit of veganism. Such a quasi-religious, moral, puritanical attitude turns many prospective allies, myself included, into supposed enemies, right? I mean, you would be hard-pressed to find someone who is less able to see any manifestation of animal cruelty than me. I literally, it's pathological. As I said, I can't watch National Geographic, and I'm an evolutionary scientist. This doesn't mean that I can't also explain why I enjoy a juicy burger. But I do struggle with that moral issue, and therefore that's why I spend many, many hours preparing this talk, because I struggle as a human being. I struggle, in this case, in the gray world, not in the black, not in the white, in the fact that I am eating a piece of meat that probably has come from an animal that was not ethically treated. And therefore, what I will do is roll up my sleeves and hopefully contribute in whatever small way I can to the discussion, so that we might find ways to reduce animal suffering. But that doesn't mean that we turn into vegans. That's not a viable or feasible solution. In the same way that we could remove the likelihood of you suffering from brain cancer if we behead you. That guarantees that you will never get brain cancer. Now, to the schmucks who will say, no, but that's a wrong analogy. That's called hyperbolic intervention. Don't take the analogy, the humorous analogy, at complete literal face value. What I'm saying is, you can't implement a policy that for most people will simply be untenable. So you could either live in your unicorn utopias founded on ideological dogma, or you could try to understand the evolutionary forces associated with this issue that will hopefully allow us to have a pragmatic approach to reduce the needless and horrifying suffering of our animal cousins. I hope this was valuable to you. I know that it certainly was valuable for me to organize my thinking, and even to those who I seem to be holding a lot of disdain towards. It's nothing personal. I just despise when people write to me, especially a 20-year-old who, you know, is younger than some of my socks and speaks to me in such a disrespectful way, as though, you know, I've never thought of these issues. But through his class at Wellesley in Rhetoric 101, he's going to teach me all these things. We can speak to each other in a way that recognizes that this is a difficult issue, one that, if we are lovers of animals, we all want to see improved, but we can do so without being the Taliban. Cheers, everybody. Ciao.